We're going to explore the commonplace strangeness of a century ago today, beliefs and behaviors that, although seemingly normal at the time, now appear ridiculous to us. What if it were commonplace to use leeches as medicine, pose for pictures with polar bear costumes, or sip radioactive water to treat fatigue? Watch closely because this film will challenge your preconceived notions about normalcy as it examines the strange social mores, medical theories, and cultural trends of the 1920s. 1. Radium water and radioactive elixirs. Radium was heralded as a miraculous treatment in the early 1900s. It was introduced as a revitalizing tonic that was put into a wide variety of products, ranging from chocolate bars to health water, and it was advertised for its vigor and strength. One well-known instance is that of Eben Byers, a rich athlete who drank Radithor, a beverage that contained radium and claimed to alleviate weariness. At first, it was energizing. Nevertheless, in the end, it caused Byers' health to deteriorate in a horrible way, and he passed away. Radium was highly promoted since it was thought to be innocuous and even fashionable. Users had no idea that glowing radium would practically devour their bones. They were completely unaware of this fact. After the suffering of industrial workers and rads, also known as radium girls, aroused worries, it wasn't until much later that scientists and media brought to light the harmful effects on health. 2. Leech therapy and bloodletting. Leeches and bloodletting continued to be recognized as effective medical treatments for infections, fevers, and imbalance into the 1920s and even into the 1940s. In spite of the fact that penicillin was on the horizon, medical professionals felt that removing blood would restore health, even for the most severe conditions. In hospitals, it was not uncommon to see buckets full of leeches. During the sessions, some patients lost as much as 80% of their blood. Over-the-counter, deadly chemicals such as mercury, which was used to treat syphilis, as well as heroin, opium, and cocaine, which were used to treat colds, were readily available for purchase. The marketing of these addictive pharmaceuticals was done without any regard. They were a common item on prescription pads back then, but it is unfathomable today. 3. Children at work and no refrigerators. During the 1920s, child labor was very prevalent. Children as young as 5 years old were employed in factories, mines, or farms for little wages. This hazardous employment was often considered to be a normal part of life. Formal education that went beyond the fundamentals was uncommon, particularly in rural regions. And since there was no refrigeration in the home, one's everyday existence revolved around the dangers of rotten food. Salt, smoke, or even the most basic of ice boxes were often used by families to preserve perishable food. Due to the fact that food spoiling was an inevitable part of living, it was important to go grocery shopping every day. 4. Unpredictable beauty and gender norms. Beauty standards and gender norms that were prevalent in the early 20th century are foreign to us now. Up until at least the 1930s, it was deemed obscene for women to wear trousers, which was regarded as scandalous. Even while going out for leisure activities, it was anticipated that people would dress formally. Suits, gowns, gloves, and hats were commonplace, a combination of Reddit and. This was a challenge that was made by flappers during the Roaring '20s, but they were severely criticized. They flaunted their sexual independence by smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, bobbing their hair, and doing filthy jazz dances at speakeasies. In the past, traditionalists saw flappers as irresponsible and immoral. Nevertheless, in recent years, they have evolved into icons of liberation and modernism. This website is bbc.co, ukin.wikipedia.org.blogs.loc.gov. Tattoos, which were historically considered to be a taboo, were once solely linked with criminals or circus performers. The majority of women and men in the globe avoided getting tattoos altogether. 5. Visiting without invitation and casual dynamite. A polite society is characterized by limits in the present day, although it was completely acceptable to show up without prior notice around 100 years ago. It was rather less typical to say, "I hope I'm not disturbing," than it was to just come in unannounced for a cup of tea. Even more bizarre is the fact that dynamite was sold at hardware shops where hammers and nails were offered for sale. Even at urban hardware shops, farmers used it to remove tree stumps, and gardeners took use of it for landscaping. This was done without the need for licensure or control. To improve convenience, the risks were tolerated. 6. Science, missteps, and spiritualism. The pseudoscience of anthropometry and eugenics, which posited a correlation between the size of a person's head and their level of intellect, was widely accepted in academic circles. Physical measures were used by governments and institutions to demonstrate that there is a hierarchy of IQ among different races, which is now completely rejected. While this was going on, the concept that the dead could speak with mediums, known as spiritualism, was exploding. It was typical for those who were grieving the death of loved ones due to war or sickness to engage in activities such as seances, ghost rapping, levitating items, and even chalk writing as if instructed by spirits. Thousands of people thought it was common to communicate with loved ones who had passed away at weekly public events. 7. Strange fads and rites. In Germany, people posed for photographs with huge humans dressed as polar bears, a trend that lasted for decades. This is one example of a trend that occurred in the early 20th century that seems to be very odd now. What is the reason? Nobody is quite certain, but it was a well-liked trend in the area. There was a time when stadiums like Madison Square Garden were crowded with spectators for 6-day cycling races, in which cyclists competed virtually constantly, some of them really hallucinating from exhaustion. The extreme endurance sport hooked millions of people on raw spectacle. 8. Belief limits and everyday hazards. Before Edwin Hubble demonstrated that additional galaxies existed in 1924, many people in the field of astronomy thought that the Milky Way was the only galaxy in the universe. Prior to then, there was a prevalent belief that there were no stars or systems outside our own galaxy. Simple activities, like reading in bed by candlelight, were seen as potentially hazardous by religious authorities. They felt that doing so was tantamount to tempting destiny and may result in spiritual retribution or flames. People avoided these behaviors out of superstition and for their own protection. 9. Transition and reflection. Why, therefore, did these behaviors seem to be considered normal a century ago? They were the result of inadequate scientific explanations, cultural norms, and a lack of regulatory oversight. Certain styles, such as the flapper trend, were a precursor to advancement. There were others, such as the use of child labor or radium water, that were tolerated until evidence and change brought them to an end. The norms of sanitation, medical standards, labor rights, universal suffrage, and scientific literacy that we now live with are only some of the things that are taken for granted. These strange normals serve as a reminder of how far mankind has progressed, as well as the possibility that the accepted norms of today could one day seem to be just as weird. Like, share, and subscribe for more.